We often hear that Britain's coronavirus epidemic is unprecedented, and in many ways that's true. However, if you zoom in on the various phases of the public health crisis, it's all depressingly repetitive. In phase one, cases rise. There are calls for the Prime Minister to take tough action, but instead he reassures the public everything will be okay. In March, I shook hands with everyone. Last week, the schools are 100% safe. In phase two, we get a U-turn. Tough restrictions are put in place, though not in time to prevent mass death, and implemented so late in the day that they'll require lockdown to be tougher and longer than if earlier action had been taken. Then, and this is the phase we're currently in, to distract from government failings, we are all collectively encouraged to forget the mistakes that were made by our Tory overlords and continue to be made by them, and instead blame each other for the rising COVID death toll. It's infuriating, depressing, and above all else, predictable. Ash Sarkar, have you spent the weekend shaking your fists at mums who've gone for walks with one friend carrying a takeaway coffee?
Not just my fist, I can tell you that. I've actually been hiding in park bushes, and every time I see people enjoying their exercise too much, I leap out, I scream non-essential, and then I jab them with a cattle prod. And now I have a pending legal case against me.
No, I think that's good. People are saying it's your duty in this public health crisis to stay at home. Actually, I think that's pathetic. What you should be doing is what Ash is doing. You should be out in bushes with cattle prods, making sure that anyone who stands still for more than 30 seconds, these people should be exercised. It's called exercise for a reason. You don't stand still when you're exercising. You should be cattle prodding these people because they are the reason we have currently an average of 909 people dying every day. They're obviously
it's the wanderers and the coffee havers who've been operating within the law who are the problem. I mean, we're going to talk about this a lot on the show, but I think it is absolutely farcical that the media has jumped on this talking point so quickly. In other countries where you have authoritarian regimes, the media is kept in line with the government through violence. In this country, it's just through wanting to be part of the in-gang. So if anything, it's even more deserving of our disdain. It's pathetic. We saw it happen the first time round. We were late into lockdown, huge wave of hospitalizations and deaths. And the media were quite happy to break out their telescopic lenses and go, right, it's the problem of, people on the beach or people walking in the dales or whatever it is, rather than being able to cast their minds back to 2 weeks ago when Boris Johnson was saying schools are safe to return, or we still had the tier system, which was completely flawed. People were mixing households over Christmas. You had, yes, some rule breakers leaving London in order to be reunited with their loved ones because the government had spent the entirety of autumn saying that they'd be able to do so. And the custodians of our public conversation, who are paid exorbitant amounts per year to regurgitate government WhatsApps, seem to have conveniently forgotten all of that. They look at the kind of hospitalizations we have, which aren't likely to be from people who were infected in the last week. We know that because coronavirus has this long tail, you see a delay between infections, hospitalizations, and deaths. These are people who are likely to have been infected around like the last week of the school term, when the government was threatening to sue local authorities who wanted to shut down early to prevent transmission. It's likely that these are people who contracted their infections around the Christmas period, again, when, people thought household mixing was okay. But yeah, no, I don't pay my license fee so that Laura Koonsberg has a good memory. No, I'm just in it for Doctor Who and Drag Race UK.
It is like Groundhog Day, isn't it? I feel like I could be that could have been an introduction to a show in April. It's so similar. On the show, we are also going to talk about, this is something we didn't have in the first wave. So this is the one good thing about the second wave, is there is the beginning of a vaccine rollout. We're going to talk about the big 7 super centers that have opened today. But more than that, we're going to focus on concerns about whether or not people are potentially putting themselves at risk when they're queuing for the vaccine. I've got a GP on to talk about that. All going to be very, very informative. And of course, we're going to talk about Trump getting kicked off of Twitter, whether or not we should be thankful that tech monopolies are, I suppose, saving us from the outpourings of sort of crypto fascist white nationalists, or whether we should be worried that they have quite so much power as they do. And we're going to end the show with one of the worst Blairite extreme centrist has-beens who's been throwing rocks at Corbyn again. There's a few of these, but this one is particularly worth talking about. As ever, you know the score. We want to get more people watching this show live. Do share the show link. Tweet your comments on the hashtag TyskySour and get your super chats in. We will be going to those throughout the show. Now, today it is really worth starting by reminding ourselves quite how dire the current situation is. There have been 6,363 COVID deaths reported in the past 7 days. That's an average of 909 people dying from COVID every day. So when you see Julia Hartley saying they didn't actually die today, yeah, they might not. When we report deaths, they didn't die that day, but when you average them out, it's still 909 a day. It's appalling. There are currently 32,000 COVID patients in hospital. That's 10,000 higher than at the peak of the pandemic in April and March. And as you know, because of the lag between infections, hospitalizations, and deaths, these figures will all get much worse in the coming 2 weeks. It's no surprise then that while these figures, which should shame Boris Johnson, continue to mount, his outriders in the press have their focus on only one thing: blaming members of the public. This was the Telegraph's headline on Sunday. So they led with police to issue fines after one warning. If you watch the Andrew Marr show on Sunday morning, it was all about this. It was all about, do we need to get the police to get tougher on members of the public because they're not following the rules? On the Telegraph front page this morning was a very similar story, this time briefed from Number 10. Ministers consider tightening lockdown. So this is all the new rules which might need to be put into place to stop us going to the park because it's making it impossible to get a control of this virus, even though estate agents are still working in their offices. Anyway, now in terms of these headlines, you might say, now look, Michael, these are just headlines reporting the news. This isn't the Telegraph's leader page. This isn't an opinion piece. But what you should know, and what I'm sure you do, is that the choice of what you put on the front page affects more than what you put in your opinion pages, how people interpret the news, what people think is the most important story of that day. And what you're seeing here is the Telegraph, which spent months promoting the lockdown skeptics, who, because we have a prime minister who is so desperate for approval from this country's right wingers, both on his backbenches and in the Tory press, that could have affected government policy. One of the reasons we're going into a lockdown quite so late, why we're seeing so many deaths, is because of the likes of the Telegraph, the Spectator, all of these outrider outlets who were telling Boris Johnson, actually, maybe let's go for natural herd immunity. Actually, maybe lockdowns don't really work. That's why we're in the situation we're in. And now these same newspapers are saying, oh, by the way, now we're seeing 909 deaths a day on average, every day for 7 days. What should you do now? Don't question our editorial line. Blame your neighbor. Now, here I'm focusing on the Telegraph, who've been wholly nothing but a malicious influence on our government during this pandemic and on public opinion on basically everything. I am going to go to someone who is more of a neutral figure, more seemingly anodyne. And I do, I have a lot of respect for the guy. Seems like he has a lot of expertise and probably isn't malicious in intent, but he has joined in, and I think this is a shame, into this rush to blame members of the public and make it seem as if the only way out of this pandemic is to control people's or pressure people into making individual choices.
The most important thing is actually people's individual choices. If people choose only to leave home if they have to, for work, exercise, or essential things, to absolutely keep their distance, to follow all those rules, that really will bring things down. It's individual choices that matters more than rules at this stage of the game.
Now I like Chris Whitty, and I see where he's coming from. He thinks his job as the country's chief doctor is to communicate with the public what he needs the public to do. And at this point in time, what the government and what the medics and what people in the NHS need the public to do, I agree with this. I'm not saying go break the rules because it's all Boris Johnson's fault, so fuck it. I think we have a responsibility to follow the rules for the doctors and nurses of this country and the people who are at risk of dying from coronavirus. But I do think that in doing that job as he's interpreted it, he is letting Boris Johnson off the hook. Because he has an enormous platform there. He doesn't need to say the most important thing in terms of how we get out of this pandemic now is the individual choices that people make. Because that's not really true. The way we could have got out of this pandemic is a government who responded much quicker to the facts when they changed. When Boris Johnson was advised on the 22nd of December that we would need a lockdown, we would need schools to be closed, otherwise there was no chance of getting R below 1. If he'd have acted then, that would have been the way that we get out of this mess quicker than we have. Not people stopping going to the park and drinking a coffee. And also you might say, okay, but that's rehashing ancient history. He's a doctor. He's living in the moment. He's not here to fight political battles. What he wants to do is make sure that in future, we have the best outcome we possibly have, and we are where we are, and we need everyone to follow the rules. Now, again, that's not quite right, because there are things that the government could be doing at this very moment that would make this lockdown far more effective than if people felt guilty when they went for a run and stopped for 30 seconds to speak to a friend. And that would be to tell unessential businesses to close, to stop people going into estate agents' offices because their bosses want them there because they can better control their labor when they're in the building, and say, look, unless you are an essential business, and when I say essential, I mean essential, then you should be closed right now. The government could do that. They could force Rishi Sunak to cough up a bit more money to pay people proper sick pay. There are things in the here and now that would be way more important than whether or not people go to a park. And I think Chris Whitty does have a responsibility to bring that up. Now, to be fair to the BBC, so Chris Whitty did a huge media round this morning. He was speaking to basically everyone. He went on Radio 5 Live, and the host did push him on this point. So here is Whitty fielding a question on Radio 5 Live.
Yes, there's a question related to that. It's a good specific one as well. It comes from Stephen Devon. Why isn't this lockdown tougher? Why are coffee shops open for takeaways? Other shops are open for click and collect. And you have to close everything that isn't essential. If you take away people's reasons to go out, they will stay in. Lots of questions on that. Your response, Professor Whitty?
Well, I think that what ministers in all the various nations of the UK have been trying to do is walk a balance between absolutely all the things that can be done to minimise contacts and keeping society going in a way, because we have to be able to maintain this over many weeks. This is not something which we can just do for a week and then it's done. And they make a number of choices, and those are all about that balance. But what I would say to someone who's thinking of going to meet a friend in a coffee shop is really, please don't. I think it is anything we can do to minimise the amounts of contacts between households we should do. People are going in their own household, that's a different situation, but try to minimise contacts between households. It's absolutely critical we do this in this really difficult period in this epidemic.
No, I agree with Chris Whitty. Again, it's absolutely essential that we don't mix in different people's households at this point in time. We desperately need the R rate to go down. We desperately need new infections to go down, because we already have baked in loads more deaths, and probably the NHS being completely overwhelmed. I mean, it is already overwhelmed, but so overwhelmed that they have to turn away people who would benefit from treatment. That's all very likely. So I agree with Chris Whitty. There isn't really a reason for you to go and buy a coffee with your friend. Go for a walk in the park if you need some emotional support, sure. But people queuing at coffee shops, it doesn't sit right with me. But again, he is not only covering for the government there, he's repeating their bullshit. He says ministers, what they have to do is they have to make a balance between the economy and our health, and between making this lockdown sustainable. Now, there are many things I think you need to make this lockdown sustainable. You need to make sure people can, sort of survive emotionally. And one of those is you let people go for a walk with one other person. One of those is you give people a timeline for how we are going to get out of this phase in the lockdown. One of those is you don't gaslight people by saying that actually, I told you that schools were safe a week ago. Now I'm telling you that getting a coffee is really dangerous, and I'm not going to apologize for that. These are all things I think would help keep the British people sane during this lockdown. One thing I don't see as completely necessary is coffee shops being open. One thing I don't see as completely necessary is visits to houses, for people buying and selling properties. I don't see that as necessary for us to get through this entire lockdown. So when Chris Whitty sort of says, oh, well, this is a balance, it might seem odd that we've got coffee shops open, which doesn't, by the way, just attract people to buy coffee. It also means that whoever works in that coffee shop is being pressured to go into work instead of being furloughed. We should be paying baristas to stay at home. We shouldn't be saying, if you want to get paid, you have to go into work and risk not only your own health, but anyone who you might come into contact with, especially on public transport. This is not complex things, and he shouldn't be repeating that lie that this is a balance. This isn't about a balance between an effective lockdown and a sustainable one. This is about a balance between the Conservative government thinking, well, we can't let that many, we can't create mass death so that we've got double the death toll of France, but we also can't give enough support to businesses that it undermines the disciplining of labor and the neoliberal system, which we have spent our lifetimes, trying to win, basically trying to implement in this country. So don't buy into it, Chris. You're above this. He's apparently, a very good doctor, works on Christmas Eve. I don't think he's a snake, but he should be doing better than this. Ash, are you as disappointed in the chief medical officer as I am at the moment?
I mean, I am disappointed, but I think that we've got to put a question not just to him, but our entire government and way of living, which is why couldn't we be Vietnam? Why couldn't we be Vietnam, where you had this huge mobilization of state institutions, you had shorter, much stricter lockdowns, and then a quicker return to normal with a much lower death rate, 35 deaths. Because I'm not saying this as a why can't we be like Vietnam in a casual way or an offhand way, because the answers to that, I think, are pretty revealing. One is the 40 years of hollowing out of our state capacity to really do anything, right? So you've got state institutions, Public Health England, which are the result of the kind of balkanization of the public sector, right? That's been a result of neoliberalism. So we have this constant problem of one hand not knowing what the other hand is up to, right? So that has really affected the mobilization of things like test and trace, getting PPE to the right places. It's been really quite terrible. And then you've got what you were talking about as some ideological constraints, which go to the very heart of the government, which includes civil service as well as, ministers and MPs and people who are elected, which is that the minute you undermine the work imperative, either through having a benefit system that you can live on or support for businesses, which means that they could, survive this pandemic, the cure there, which is helping people to stay at home, is worse than the disease in their view, right? They think that it will make everybody work shy, layabouts, and that the economy won't be up and running afterwards. And I think that it's a grave misinterpretation of where people's heads are at. Lots of people do miss the sort of social contact that they had at work, right? Even if they fucking hate their boss and even if they fucking hate their job and even if they don't get paid enough, right? Having that outdoor life, people do miss. And there's also the sense that there are those sort of, archetypical Tory small business owners who really have their backs to the wall at the moment. Some of them, I think, will reconsider how they view Rishi Sunak if their business goes under. And I'll give you an example, because you're talking about coffee shops. I did buy a takeaway coffee today, Michael. Don't cancel me. Don't
cattle prod me. For you, Ash. Cattle prod for you.
I know. I bought a takeaway coffee from a local cafe in Tottenham, and it's not anything special. This cafe, right? It's not a hipster barista, small batch coffee beans kind of place. It's not a growth business, right? He doesn't want to open another cafe. It is a builder's cafe. That is the kind of the majority of their trade, a real like toast and two teas kind of place. And it's been like a ghost town. And I was walking down the road, saw that it was empty, saw that it was open. I was like, I'll get a coffee. I started chatting to him, because he was also, I think, a bit starved of human contact, been on his own in there all day. And I was saying, well, why are you open? Why are you open? Your business clearly isn't great at the moment. And he was like, well, I've applied for everything and I've not had a penny. I've not had a penny of government support through this whole thing. Not a single penny. He said that the process was really confusing. He doesn't know if it's gone through okay, and he feels completely abandoned by the state. He's had no financial support. The second thing is that he is open, and he's not even making enough money to cover his electricity and his gas to keep the place open. Right? He's fallen behind on his rent by 3 months. He's getting hassle from the landlord. He knows he can't be evicted from the premises, but he's getting hassle from the landlord. He's got no idea how he's going to be able to make up the shortfall even when he's able to reopen, because it's not one of those like hand over fist kind of growth businesses. It's a small greasy spoon cafe of the kind that you see everywhere, but which are kind of, the backbone of the community in its own way. And he's really looking at the prospect of losing his business for 15 years. And so I asked him, what is it that you would want the government to do differently? We chatted a bit and he was like, well, I just need enough money to survive this. And that's it. You know, it's really very simple. So when you've got a 15-year-old business, right, run by this, you know, Turkish uncle who has, you know, been working hard every day of his life and he's thinking he's going to go under, that's not a sign of a healthy society, either in terms of the organization of the economy or our response to pandemic management. So that goes back to the question of why can't we be Vietnam? Why can't we be Vietnam? And it's because in lots of ways, we've got a much more corrupt government. We've got a government which would rather splash billions on a failed test and trace system, bunging millions to, you know, companies which have no history of producing PPE, but it happens to be run by a mate. So there you go. Rather than giving the, you know, 10,000 quid, whatever it is, this guy needs to get through the pandemic. It's a real statement of where the values are. I'm being told off for banging on the table. I'm so sorry, Fox, but I'm just impassioned about this. And I will get another takeaway coffee for as long as he's open. I'm sorry, Michael.
No, I'm not here to judge people, Ash, other than Boris Johnson and Rishi Sunak. And that anecdote you've just given me about, you know, that coffee shop owner in Tottenham, why that really frustrates me is because I was listening to The World at 1 today. It's on Radio 4 at 1 p.m. It's quite informative usually, but this infuriated me because the host, Sarah Montague, in her introduction, she said, the government have a problem because R still isn't going below 1. They're still seeing lots of activity in the country. And there are a few other levers for the government to pull. That's what she said. So it's this idea, sort of like, the government have done everything they can do. And this is also the line which is coming from government ministers. The government have done everything they can possibly do. So now the responsibility is in your hands, the people. What you have to do is now step up because we've stepped up. No, they haven't stepped up. Yes, we will step up because we don't want the NHS to be overwhelmed, because we have solidarity with doctors and nurses in this country and people who are at risk of coronavirus. But this idea that they don't have other levers to pull, it's just a lie. Give this coffee shop owner enough money so that he can close, and then no one has reason to go queue to buy coffee outside his shop. And then if it was a bigger calf, no one would have a reason to go and take public transport to get in there and work with other colleagues. It's ridiculous. Unfortunately, though, it seems to have worked. And this is really depressing. I hate this. I hate every time these polls get shared on Twitter. So I'm sorry. I apologize for you know, showing them to you. This is from YouGov, which is who Britons think is most responsible for the rise in coronavirus cases over the last month. And 58% have said the public and 28% have said the government. Now you can see there's a bit of a Conservative Labour split. So among the Conservatives, 80% blame the public. Among Labour voters do swing towards blaming the government, but to a much lesser sort of split than among the Conservative side. So overall, people are much more inclined to blame the public. And this is what's bizarre for this. For the recent rise in coronavirus cases, right? If you're talking about if we're still seeing a rise of coronavirus cases in 2 weeks' time, sure, maybe there's a bit of maybe people should be following the rules a bit more. Again, I don't think that will be the real issue. I think it's that Rishi Sunak isn't paying people enough money to close their businesses. But everyone saw that a week ago Boris Johnson was saying that schools are 100% safe. So now, if they've been told everything is 100% safe, how can they now be looking at people and saying, oh, this rise in cases is the fault of the public? I find this really, really depressing. And obviously the reason is because Britain's press is not doing their job properly. If we had a press corps that did their job properly, those polling results would not look anything like that. We're going to go on to our next story. First of all, we have over 2,500 people watching. Let's get that to 3,000. Make sure you share the stream. That's if you're a regular. If you are new to this show, hit that subscribe button. We go live every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday at 7 p.m. And then also for, you know, surprise stories, surprise shows. It's not like a birthday party, but when there's a news story that we feel we just have to cover straight away. Now, the good news story from the government today was the ramping up of Britain's vaccination drive. There were 7 new mass vaccination centres which opened their doors this morning. They are on top of existing GP centres offering the vaccine and will be joined by some pharmacy-led centres. Boris Johnson spoke to the press from a newly set up vaccination centre at Ashton Gate Stadium in Bristol.
What we're doing here in Bristol today is launching the first of the mass vaccination centres. We'll have 50 of these by the end of the month. That's in addition to the 233 hospital sites, the 1,000 plus GP sites, and a first go of about 200 community pharmacies, and we'll be ramping them all up. As I speak to you today, we've done about 2 million people, maybe a bit more. Were about 2.4 million jabs all in, I think, across the whole of the UK. And in the next few days, as we get towards that target of the 15th of February, 15 million that we want to do, obviously the NHS is going to be ramping that up massively. And it's still the case, as I talk to you today, that the UK has done more vaccinations than any other country in Europe, but we cannot be complacent. And the worst thing now would be for us to allow success in rolling out a vaccine program to breed any kind of complacency about the state of the pandemic.
Now, Boris Johnson, if you're worried about the vaccine breeding complacency about the state of the pandemic, maybe talk to Rishi Sunak and ask him to provide proper support for businesses so that they don't have to open when we've got record rises in coronavirus cases. Or maybe talk to yourself 3 weeks ago and ask yourself to follow sage advice instead of blindly ignoring it. Maybe talk to yourself last week when you were speaking to the nation saying schools are 100% safe. If we're talking about complacency, it's not the rest of the country you have to worry about. Of course, though, there is some good news here, right? I'm not going to pretend this vaccination drive isn't a great thing. 2.2 million people having been vaccinated already is great news. Perhaps we'd like to see it higher. I mean, of course, we'd like to see it higher, but he's right that this is the highest number of people who've been vaccinated in Europe. Something's obviously going relatively well. We also expect to see that once this vaccine is rolled out to the most vulnerable parts of the population, which we should see deaths reduce quite dramatically, from March onwards. It's not going to save us from this current wave. We all know that. However, despite the positives of this vaccine rollout, there have been some concerns about the manner of vaccine delivery. This video is going viral this weekend on Twitter. So you can see here people who are queuing for a GP centre in Lewisham, and you can see it's an enormous queue, everyone very old, and it's clearly very difficult to maintain social distancing. Now, that video was filmed by someone called Paul Demetrius. He tweeted the GP practice in Lewisham where it took place, saying, "My parents have been isolating since February 20th. On arrival for Dad's COVID-19 vaccine time slot, met with this circus. They left without it. Answers." So you've got a couple of problems there, which is you've got people who are obviously standing outside in the cold. Again, these are very elderly people. This will be many people who are over 80. So standing outside in the cold is not ideal anyway, but also they're not really able to social distance. If these are people who've been self-isolating since February the 20th, we know that they don't become immune for a couple of weeks after getting the vaccine. It would be an awful shame if people were to catch coronavirus whilst queuing for a vaccine after self-isolating for 11 months. Now, we should say, in response to that tweet, because it got a lot of traction, Lewisham's NHS Clinical Commissioning Group replied on Twitter, and they wrote, "We're sorry your parents faced this situation. This was the first vaccination day for the service. Lessons have been learned. Vaccinators doubled to reduce waiting time. Patients asked to arrive 5 minutes before appointment. These will ease queues and hopefully reassure your parents." So potentially this is just teething problems, but even if it is just teething problems, the costs of these mistakes could be very high. So there was an interesting piece published in Unheard today. This was by someone who had volunteered at a vaccine centre and was very worried by what she had seen. So she writes in the article, "I spent Sunday volunteering at a vaccination centre, and I'm seriously worried that some vaccination hubs are at risk of becoming super spreader sites. The day began at a youth centre. All the volunteers took lateral flow tests, which all came out negative. These detect COVID-19 in only half of asymptomatic people, but they are better than nothing. However, once we got into the building, my heart sank. The whole operation was set up in an indoor basketball court. Half of it was dedicated to vaccinations and the other half was full of blue plastic chairs. There were large windows, but if they could be opened, they weren't. The only source of ventilation were the doors in and out." And later, the article goes on to say, "The average patient going through one of these centres spends a significant amount of time within 2 meters of about 10 different people. This isn't even accounting for the fact that very vulnerable people often struggle with the system. They walk in the wrong direction, use the bathroom a lot, take their masks off, lean in very close when talking, and often they have carers who add to the room's body count. Now, the author of that article is keen to say that this wasn't the fault of the people who were running that centre. She says they were working incredibly hard and actually following the rules to the letter. But the author says that the advice from Public Health England didn't seem adequate to stop that kind of thing happening, which does seem risky. That seems like a risk of spread there, to stop that kind of thing happening. So how worried should we be about super spreader events at vaccination centres? And what is the experience of medical staff on the front line? To discuss just that issue, I'm delighted to be joined by Louise Irvin, a GP and campaigner with Keep Our NHS Public. So Louise's GP practice joined with others in Lewisham to begin administering the vaccine last Friday, but it was not the one where you saw that long queue in that video. Louise, thank you so much for joining us today. I want to start by, I know you've just seen the report we've given. There are a couple of sort of fairly worrying stories about the initial vaccine rollout there. Does that fit with what you've seen on the front line?
Well, it doesn't really fit with what I've seen in my own health centre, because I think we've all learned things from other local areas doing it first. But it does, I think it's very difficult really to organise mass vaccination, if you think about it, in a situation where close contact between people is dangerous, where you've got a highly transmissible virus. You, by definition, for mass vaccination, you have to get a lot of people into a space. Ideally, you get them in and through quickly. You have quick throughput. You have enough space so they can be safely distanced, and you have really good ventilation. And that's all harder than it sounds. For example, when I was vaccinating on Saturday, it was a bitterly cold day, and when the window in the room was open, it was absolutely freezing. But if we closed it, there wasn't ventilation. So, that was difficult. People do come in with their carers if they're over 80 to help with perhaps translating, or with with whether somebody is hard of hearing or they don't speak English. So that made it, there were more people in the room because of carers. So I think to the logistics are key to doing this safely. I think where we were doing it on Saturday, I was quite pleased with the flow. People didn't have to wait long, and it was well ventilated. And I think we were doing it safely. But it's very right that people raise these concerns, because we do have to make sure that people are confident in the vaccination process.
And so when I've spoken to people about the vaccination process, everyone, I don't speak to many people at all actually who are skeptical about getting the vaccine, but I do speak to a lot of people who feel like maybe this lockdown will last forever because the government are so bad at doing everything. So they look at the test and trace and isolate system, which just didn't work very well, and say, well, if they do that with the vaccine, we could be in this situation for a year or something like that. So as someone who's working, on the front line, you'll see the errors in the advice or what's working well. I mean, how confident do you think our viewers should be in this, not the safety of the vaccine itself, but how the program is being rolled out?
I think there has to be a sense of realism. So even to reach the most at risk, 13 million people that have been deemed to be most at risk, and healthcare workers, could take us many weeks. The thing is that although we're prioritising the most vulnerable, the people who are most vulnerable to dying if they get COVID, that is people who are over 80, and after that people over 75 and people over 70, they're not the people that are getting the disease more frequently. The disease is actually affecting younger people, spreading more quickly amongst younger people. And in fact, I read a statistic that something like 75% of people in intensive care units at the moment are under 70. So therefore, it's quite right, we should be vaccinating the older age group. But the thing is that the virus is spreading quite rapidly amongst people who are perhaps less likely to get serious illness. But because so many people are getting it in the younger age groups, a certain proportion of them will also get seriously ill. And sadly, a certain proportion of them will die. So it's very important we don't let up on our protections, which is, there are things we can all do, like wear masks, wash our hands, maintain a distance. But as you said, it's not just what people can do. In fact, the recent research that's come out from the British Medical Journal, which I was reading today, shows that something like 90% of people, over 90% of people, are adhering to the restrictions. 85% think that they endorse the January lockdown, and 77% think it should have happened earlier. So that shows a strong support in the public for quite strong measures to make this effective. And I think what we must have then is government support for people to isolate when they are infected or when they're in contact. And that must mean paying people their full wages so that they can afford to self-isolate. Otherwise, it's not going to work. We're going to have several weeks of rising cases and more people in hospital and more people dying.
No, I think that's such an important point. Even people who are, whose main role now, and I know you're also a GP, so you'll be doing many things at the moment. But even people whose main focus now is on vaccines are like, guys, this is not going to save us in the next 3 months or even the next 6 months, as you say. Even once we've vaccinated those people who are most likely to die, the pressure isn't going to let up on hospitals for a really long time. I wanted to finally get you to, I suppose, sort of tell us what the experience has been like vaccinating people, because we hear so many grim stories throughout this pandemic, but I know that you've now been in contact with people often who've been self-isolating for 12 months or 10 months who are now getting a vaccine which they think will give them, which will ultimately give them some freedom. So what are people telling you? And also, I suppose, is there hesitancy? I feel like people are less hesitant than we were initially told to expect.
I'm not getting the feeling that there's a lot of hesitancy, certainly among the population that's currently being vaccinated, which is the over 80s and now the over 75s. It was extremely moving on a Saturday. It really brought tears to my eyes. People came dressed up for the day, especially the women. And that reminds me of my mother, who's 95 and who had COVID, was hospitalized and survived, and she's going to be getting her vaccine tomorrow. But she would, for an occasion like this, she would dress as smartly as possible, and that's what I noticed. For them, it was a really important event, and many said that to me, this is the first time I've been out in 9 months, and they were really grateful. It was incredibly moving, and I think they're from that generation that have appreciated the value of vaccinations. They're from the generation that came before the onset of the NHS. And they do appreciate the NHS, and they've seen the benefits of what is provided by the NHS, including vaccination campaigns. And I think we should be taking our example from them, and that everybody should be feeling positive about this vaccination campaign.
Louise, thank you so much for speaking with us today and that really moving account of the vaccinations. And obviously, keep doing what you're doing. We're all thinking of you guys on the front line trying to get us out of this mess.
Thank you.
So thank you so much. That was very moving, wasn't it? We're going to go to some comments now. We've got lots of great comments from you. Ali Eka Mustafa with 20 quid. Thank you very much. I'm a doctor in Leeds. I feel Witty and Valence have let us down in their lack of highlighting Boris's failure to adhere to sage advice. One could argue they contravene GMC guidance on good medical practice. Hugely disappointing. And that's interesting. I don't have detailed knowledge of what good medical practice, what's written in there, but I do think that lots of people are kind of disappointed that they haven't stood up to him in public. They are civil servants, but they're not employed by Boris Johnson. They're employed by the state, by the government. They are allowed to speak out against the Prime Minister. He's not their boss. They're not supposed to be his lackeys. In private, I'm sure they're not, but in public, they could be doing more. On Twitch, Jane Scarlett says massive queues outside CJ Centre as well. Potentially that's Croydon Junction is what Fox is suggesting to me, but we're not sure. I'm not sure about vulnerable people waiting outside in -1 degrees. Yeah, so it seems that this is a bit of a problem. People are suggesting maybe you could do drive-through testing, but you do understand the government are in a position where they want to get needles into lots and lots of people's arms, And the quickest way to do that is to get people all to amass in the same space. I'm hoping that this is teething problems, and ultimately we'll be getting people to come in much, much smaller windows, which is what it sounds like was happening at Louise's GP practice on the weekend. So hopefully these are teething problems. I assume that if these issues continue, and there's going to be a lot of political pushback. But as I say, it's urgent that this happens, because the negative consequences from this could be enormous. Act Up for Good with 20 quid said, whatever happened to test and trace? Very good question. Completely failed after spending £22 billion on it, because it all went to Sarkar and basically call center operators. Not to criticize the people who are employed to do this, but this should have gone to local public health services, people who knew the area. Instead, it was an enormous waste of money. It is worth saying, though, that everywhere test and trace has basically been a bit overwhelmed at this period of time. However good our test and trace system was, it wouldn't really work when there are 50,000 cases a day. So when people talk about fixing our test and trace system, that's more for at the end of this lockdown, not so much because it could get us out of it now. Basically, now we just need these quite severe lockdown measures. Jane Hayward with a £5, thank you very much. Such a touching account of the vaccination process from Louise Irvin. Never heard of it talked about like that before. Thank you so much for that. Totally echo that. I thought that was such a moving account. And Tristan Brokenshire with £10. Yes, I'm a barista and flat whites aren't essential. It means my household is way less of a bubble and there's no new safety measures with an easier transmissible virus. Yeah, I don't disagree. And Tristan, I'm again, if this was a phone, and I'd love to ask you, are you being pressured to go in? What's the particular dynamic there? I know that presumably, you can't just say I want to get furloughed. If your boss wants that flat white shop to stay open, then it gets to stay open. And as Ash's anecdote showed, potentially, we can't necessarily blame the boss either, because Rishi Sunak is giving such weak support that they don't really have much of a choice but to stay open. Thank you all for those comments and those super chats. Very, very interesting. We are going to go to our next story, which is not a coronavirus one. Before we do that, if you are enjoying the show, you know the score. Tysky Sour, Novara Media, only possible because of your kind support. If you are already a subscriber, thank you so much. You make this possible. If not, please do go to novaramedia.com/support and donate the equivalent of 1 hour's wage a month. Now, you can't tell the story of Donald Trump's presidency without extensive reference to his Twitter feed. Trump has used his account to target racial abuse at congresswomen, to threaten nuclear war with foreign powers, to amplify far-right misinformation, and to make repeated false claims about electoral fraud. However, it was tweets judged to have incited Wednesday's riot on the Capitol that finally got him permanently banned from the platform 12 days before leaving office. So, announcing the ban, Twitter put out the following statement on Twitter. So they tweeted, after a close review of recent tweets from the real Donald Trump account and the context around them, we have permanently suspended the account due to the risk of further incitement of violence. And they went on to expand on their reasoning in a blog post. It's worth reading all of this, actually. It's quite interesting. So they write, after a close review of recent tweets from the real Donald Trump account and the context around them, specifically how they are being received and interpreted on and off Twitter, we have permanently suspended the account due to the risk of further incitement of violence. In the context of horrific events this week, we made it clear on Wednesday that additional violations of the Twitter rules would potentially result in this very course of action. Our public interest framework exists to enable the public to hear from elected officials and world leaders directly. It is built on a principle that people have a right to hold power to account in the open. However, we made it clear going back years that these accounts are not above our rules entirely and cannot use Twitter to incite violence, among other things. We will continue to be transparent around our policies and their enforcement. So the argument being made there is they're saying, look, the reason we were so lenient to Donald Trump up to now is that we have a more relaxed policy when it comes to elected representatives than we do with any old Twitter user. Now, I mean, that makes sense. They say, look, they have a right to broadcast their voice to a wider public because they have elected office. But they've said that because now it's got into the realm of inciting violence, these things have changed. They also link, or they put in this press release, the messages that they decided crossed the line, which would take Donald Trump off Twitter. And what's interesting is I mean, these aren't the worst Donald Trump tweets. So the first one they cite is this. So it's Donald Trump on the 8th of January. The 75 million great American patriots who voted for me, America first and Make America Great Again, will have a giant voice long into the future. They will not be disrespected or treated unfairly in any way, shape, or form. And they also mention a follow-up tweet, which was, to all those who have asked, I will not be going to the inauguration on January the 20th. Now, they sort of describe why these tweets violated their policy. They say they violated their glorification of violence policy. And they said that, I mean, they focused really not what was said in the tweets, but how they would be interpreted by Trump supporters, and therefore saying it would be irresponsible to leave them up. To give a couple of examples, they said the phrase American patriots is being interpreted as support for those who committed violence on Capitol Hill. And they said the announcement that Trump would not be attending Biden's inauguration was being interpreted by his supporters as a signal the event would be safe to target. Now, you might say that's a bit of a reach. I mean, he's just said he's not going to attend the inauguration. That doesn't really, to read into that a subtext, so you should attack it on the level of textual analysis, that seems like a bit of a reach. They'll argue that actually, if you go on Parler, we'll get onto that in a moment, that's also gone, but if you go on to the communities where Donald Trump supporters congregate, they are sort of interpreting these tweets to mean that Donald Trump is encouraging violence. Ash, I want to throw to you. These definitely aren't the worst offending tweets we've seen from Donald Trump's account. So from your perspective, why is this happening now? Why has he only just been suspended?
Well, it's safe to alienate a president who is being kicked out of power, isn't it? These huge corporations like Twitter, Facebook, Google, they're also politically vulnerable. There are certain kinds of legislation they don't want to see enacted. They want a sympathetic ear in the White House. And we've got someone like Donald Trump who derives so much power from Twitter. It was not safe to boot him off or to implement their terms of use from the perspective of the self-interest of these companies. So I don't think that this is a decision that's been made with one eye on the protection or upholding of democracy. It's about taking action when you're confident in the knowledge that all you'll receive is plaudits. I do want to say that, like everybody else, I was overjoyed with the image of Donald Trump, sort of parping impotently into the void when he no longer has his Twitter account. But I do think that this is something which is actually quite dangerous. As you've pointed out, these aren't Trump's worst offending tweets. When he tweeted during the BLM protests, when the looting starts, the shooting starts, you could say that that is a much more direct incitement of violence than either of the two that you've quoted just there. And of course, in Kenosha, Kyle Rittenhouse fired into a crowd of protesters. 2 people were killed. And his account wasn't suspended or banned then. And, it's because it wasn't certain whether or not he'd still be in power, after the election. So I don't think that we can take this as some kind of altruistic or virtuous acts from these corporations. And I do think it's dangerous that completely unaccountable businesses have the ability to turn the taps on or off of our public sphere in the way that they do. And the person who I find really, really useful for shaping how I think about this is Shoshana Zuboff, who wrote The Age of Surveillance Capitalism, because I think that she takes a really reasonable and nuanced approach to thinking about this. When she looks at social media, she steers clear of the is it good or is it bad? She says that what it is our information bloodstream. It is absolutely our information bloodstream. And it is porous and it is vulnerable. And like a bloodstream, it has been very vulnerable to poison being injected into it and being able to circle around the globe and shape our politics for the worst. So it's no good just taking a Toby Young so-called free speech fundamentalist approach to thinking about it, because you're ignoring the very deleterious impacts of that poison circulating around our body politic. At the same time, you can't consider it a good thing that the owners of those platforms, who we did not vote for, who largely we do not know, who are subject to the lightest touch of regulation, are able to turn that bloodstream on or off to make decisions about who is or who isn't on it. There has been a partial democratization of our public sphere because of social media, but that is a process which is still ongoing. We are still in the very early days of it. And what we need is some kind of democratic mechanism thinking about how these things are run, how they're regulated, the kind of laws and values shaping it. And it's something that we should all be involved in rather than just being passive users. And I think that if all we do is hoot and holler and slap our knees at Donald Trump being kicked off Twitter, we don't think through those problems. We don't take them seriously. We've seen the huge impact that Facebook changing its algorithm with regards to videos had on the whole industry of journalism, but we also saw how directing away traffic from political videos may have affected the 2019 general election here. It meant that, you saw a complete collapse in eyeballs on, left-wing content coming from Momentum, which had done very, very well in 2017. So these things have a huge impact. And I think, we need to take that very seriously. And read Surveillance Capitalism. It's a great book.
No, I mean, I do think we have to take that very seriously. And again, I think, in a way, it's potentially a bit dangerous to see it again as this dichotomy of should Trump have Twitter or not, and more about how does this decision get made. And I think what was most striking to me about this account getting taken down, and I can see the utilitarian, I think probably, him not having an account is better than him having an account. We've seen before with people like Toby Robinson, people say, oh, if they go off this mainstream platform, then they'll go underground and then it'll become even more extreme. Well, to be honest, what normally happens is if they get taken off the mainstream platform, people stop listening to them. Because if you think about how the pipeline from being just someone who's interested on Facebook, Twitter, or YouTube to being radicalized with these far right accounts which just spew hate and completely divorced from any fact, the power of them isn't necessarily in communicating to people who are already seeking out this information. It's the pathway between people who are just interested in similar topics, who then get recommended a Trump tweet, or more likely, a video by one of his outriders. What did strike me though about this is how coordinated it was. So it wasn't just that Twitter decided to take Trump off their platform. It was also Facebook, Twitch, Instagram, even the unofficial Donald Trump subreddit group has been removed. So all of these organizations at the same time basically took coordinated action to take Donald Trump off the internet. And it's not just that they can sort of take a platform away from you as well. You might think, well, set up a website, blah, 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 whatever. Many right-wingers did that. Again, terrible website, Parler, awful. On it just seems to be mainly sort of racism and people threatening violence. But the point of it was to say, oh, Twitter is infringing upon our free speech, so we'll create this new platform which they can't control. Well, it turns out actually the tech giants could control it, because after there were posts sort of threatening violence with reference to the Capitol Hill riots, Amazon, who it turns out host Parler with their Amazon Web Services, they decided to remove Parler. So not only have the tech giants removed people from their own platforms, they've also removed platforms themselves. They've managed to take down Parler. We can go to also it wasn't just Amazon that took it down. It was also iTunes and Android, which took took Parler off their app store. So it means you can't get it on your phone. You can't see it on a web browser. So it's basically, it's removed from existence. This was one of the examples cited by Amazon justifying the ban, or justifying removing their hosting of Parler. You can see here, it's a picture of the Congress people who are sort of bending over, hiding from a potential shooter in the Senate. And then it says, how about make them hang, hashtag execute them for treason, hashtag treason, hashtag death to traitors, hashtag F Mike Pence. So you can see this is threatening, and also for Parler it is relatively mild. It gets a lot worse than this. Obviously you might see that and you might think, well, things like that get said on Twitter anyway. The example or the justification here from Amazon for saying why this violence being promoted on Parler was different is they say we cannot provide services to a customer that is unable to effectively identify and remove content that encourages or incites violence against others, because Parler cannot comply with our terms of service and poses a real risk to public safety. We plan to suspend Parler's account effective Sunday, January the 10th. Ash, I want to bring you in on this because I found that interesting, them saying that, it's not the fact that violent threats have been posted on Parler, which means it should be taken down. It's that they don't trust Parler to be able to police those violent threats. And, as a regular user of Twitter who gets quite a lot of threats, I mean, do these tech giants, again, this isn't us defending Parler. I mean, it seems like the people who have started that incredibly malicious. Most of the people that use it are incredibly malicious. But, do Twitter have a leg to stand on here, or do Amazon have a leg to stand on by saying Twitter's fine because they police violent threats, whereas Parler doesn't?
Well, the thing is that Twitter does have more of an infrastructure to do it. They literally have outsourced offices, based in the Philippines, where you have low-paid workers whose sole job it is to look through horrendous, violent, abusive material and take action on the reports which are made about it. So they do notionally have an infrastructure to deal with it. That's not to say that that infrastructure works or that it's particularly fair on those workers. It's not to say that it is equipped to deal with the scale of the problem. And I'm not just talking about the kind of small anonymous accounts, the kind who really enjoyed spreading a conspiracy theory about me and 3 oranges and making all sorts of violent threats. But obviously that infrastructure was not equipped to deal with Donald Trump during his presidency, when he was tweeting things like, when the looting starts, the shooting starts, when he was just coming up with falsehood after falsehood. It was something which was lacking. And I think in lots of ways was designed to be kind of lacking, because when you're unsure of where the political wind is going, you don't want to cut off either those in power or a substantive portion of your audience, I think. So I think that was a bit of designed to be crappy. Whereas Parler was from top to toe, bean to cup, designed to be a cesspit of racist, misogynist, violent, transphobic material, which was so egregious that it would be picked up pretty quickly and kicked off of Twitter. So there's an element of design here and purpose. I think that the response from Amazon to couch it in terms of, well, they don't police it, is a way of getting around the fact that very clearly it was set up under the guise of being a kind of, free speech fundamentalist project as a home for all of those completely egregious behaviors and kinds of posts which would be policed on Twitter if it was flagged and if it got through the system in the right way. So as an excuse, it's one which has got some plausibility. But again, the kind of violence which has already been done because of Parler. I've been subject to the kind of organized harassment, which is kind of coordinated on Parler, and then it migrates over to Twitter on accounts which are intended to be deleted or suspended pretty quickly. Same thing happens on my Instagram a lot. From those weeks where I literally couldn't fall asleep, I'm like, well, damage has been done. You've taken the decision when it's pretty clear that Trump is out of power. The events in the Capitol have discredited him in the eyes of the kind of, amongst the elites, right? Amongst, the interests of capital. It's like, oh, well, we can't really be seen to be too close to this anymore. He's on his way out and it's kind of distasteful. I don't think that's the kind of decision that would have been made had Trump won in November. So I think that you've got to see these things as being, inherently shaped by the political moment that we're in. And because they're shaped by the political moment we're in, if there was another Trump, if that lady with the Glock, what's her name? Lauren Boebert, the one who was like, I take a Glock to Congress.
I'm not sure I know who she is.
I find her terrifying more so than any skinhead Nazi or something, because I'm terrified of short armed women. I just think my God, there's nothing you can't do. She part of her campaign was like, I take a Glock into DC because I need to protect myself as a mother. It's like Sarah Palin 2.0 and even more different. But say she becomes the next, Republican candidate, or that QAnon woman, Marjorie Green, something or other. Again, total headbangers. say they become the next Republican candidate, say there's enough gerrymandering going on in the districts, and they win the next election, are we going to see these tech giants like Google or like Apple, like Facebook, like Twitter, start again turning a real blind eye to not just really toxic behaviors on the platform, but also these designed platforms which rely on the traffic generated by Apple and Google, and rely on their servers?
I think it's actually, and again, this is speculative, I think it's probably the other way around. I think they've probably done this now because they don't want to be seen to have a role in the rise of the next Donald Trump. Right. So I think there was always, they're mainly interested in their own corporate interests. I think the reason it was difficult for them after Trump was elected president to censor him or whatever was, one, because there is this sort of reasonable argument that if someone has a democratic mandate, it's, you should be more nervous about restricting what they say, but also because they didn't want to upset the Republicans because they thought that would then come and bite them in the arse in terms of regulation. Now the Republicans are out of power. Silicon Valley is more, allied with the likes of Biden than they are with Donald Trump. I can see them trying to put that, put that back in the box, put Pandora back in the box. They've sort of recognized that they allowed this demon to rise, and now they're using this one opportunity they have to try and make sure that doesn't happen again, or at least if it does, they're not implicated.
Can I just come back on that very, very quickly?
Then I'm just going to go through some Trump tweets because we've got some of the worst and some of the best.
Because I've been thinking about this a lot. Which is the kind of existential crisis that the Republican Party is in. So you've got a kind of move by, very senior Republicans like Ted Cruz to now distance themselves from the kind of, Trumpist rhetoric and talking points that they were quite happy to parrot over the last 4 years. And it's because they're looking at what happened in the Capitol and they're going, oh shit. But they've got a problem. The problem is that they don't have a path to the White House that includes the popular vote. They have a radicalized grassroots. Right. Lots of moderates went over to Biden. It also helps explain, Biden's victories at the primary level. But they've got this radicalized base, and it's being fed by multiple sources. Right. This separate, hermetically sealed information universe that a lot of the Republican base resides in is being fed not just by social media. So, Twitter, Facebook, and what have you. It's also being fed by Fox News. And that conspiratorial tilt, and as I'm sure you're going to demonstrate by pulling up some of, Trump's pre-presidential tweets, has been ongoing for quite some time. So I think that there is still a sizable audience for this material, and we don't know yet what's going to happen now that the social media landscape has changed somewhat to that audience. Are they going to be just sort of, delving into, deeper and weirder corners of the internet? Will there still be that conveyor belt between online conspiracy theories and national broadcast? What is going to happen in terms of the recognition of the Republican leadership and that radicalized grassroots? I think all of these things are still open questions.
I mean, they definitely are open questions. I mean, they'll definitely be forming the basis of more conversations on this show, that's for sure. I want to go through some of Trump's worst tweets, and then also, when I say best, it's very much qualified, but some of them, he was quite a good shit poster as well as being an abhorrent human being. So these are the worst. So this is, I think, one of the worst tweets of his entire presidency. So interesting. This was about the squad, obviously. So interesting to see progressive Democrat congresswomen who originally came from countries whose governments are a complete and total catastrophe, the worst, most corrupt and inept anywhere in the world, if they even have a functioning government at all, now loudly and viciously telling the people of the United States, the greatest and most powerful nation on earth, how our government is to be run. Why don't they go back and help fix the totally broken and crime-infested places from which they came? So, this is the most classic bog standard racism, telling people of color to go back to where they came, even though, 3 of the squad were born in America. And I mean, it's an incredibly offensive thing to say to someone, even if they were born elsewhere. That goes without saying. The racism also obviously didn't start once he became president. And it would have been easier for Twitter to censor him at this point. So this is from back in 2012. An extremely credible source has called my office and told me that Barack Obama's birth certificate is a fraud. So Donald Trump was, of course, one of the main proponents of the racist conspiracy theory that Barack Obama wasn't born in the United States. Obviously, if you're not born in the United States, that disqualifies you from being president. So that would have been, if true, it wasn't true. There was never any evidence whatsoever. This was just a racist conspiracy theory put forward by people like Donald Trump. That would have meant he couldn't be president. Donald Trump went further with this, though. Not only was this credible source told him about it, he also speculated that maybe Obama had killed people to keep this a secret. So he tweeted in 2013, "How amazing. The state health director who verified copies of Obama's birth certificate died in a plane crash today. All others lived." And racist trolling of Obama was not just with reference to his birth certificate. It was one of his favorite pastimes before he became president. This one's pretty gross. Our great African-American president hasn't exactly had a positive impact on the thugs who are so happily and openly destroying Baltimore. So anyone who says this was only a problem because he was president, we couldn't do anything about it because he was president, they're bullshitting, because this was all before he was president. He's also got here complete misinformation, conspiracy theory. The concept of global warming was created by and for the Chinese in order to make US manufacturing non-competitive. Again, a completely made up conspiracy theory back in 2012. Twitter then could have qualified this or said this is a misinformation account. He wasn't president. They didn't do it then. And then probably some of the most damaging ones from last year were misinformation about the coronavirus. So again, he is here like a sort of Toby Young lockdown skeptic. Flu season is coming up. Many people every year, sometimes over 100,000, and despite the vaccine, die from the flu. Are we going to close down our country? No, we have learned to live with it, just like we are learning to live with COVID in most populations, far less lethal. That's not true. Remote, that's a complete lie. They did put that this tweet violated the Twitter rules above that one, but it got to stay up there. As I say, this idea that it's harder to censor someone who's been elected, fine, that does make some sense, but lots of these were before he was elected. They didn't take any responsibility for this until the winds changed, the direction that the winds were blowing changed, which is probably the main reason why it's not particularly wise for us all to allow corporate interests in Silicon Valley to determine what can and cannot be said based on their own business interests. Ash, do you want to comment on some of the worst tweets before I go on to some that are kind of, nasty but genuinely funny?
I mean, again, this shows Twitter's, I think, lack of integrity on this issue. You know that here's somebody with a huge audience and platform even before he entered politics, who was willing to come out with, lies, fabrication, racism and conspiracy theories, and was just allowed to get on with it. And he's not alone in having done that. What worries me is that because you've got this kind of, bonfire of the Trumpers on Twitter, is that those kinds of behaviors by people who have massive platforms are just going to continue going on unchecked. I'm thinking about the host of The Apprentice UK, who has his own particular history of racist tweets, where he, tweeted about I believe it was the Senegalese football team, but I can't be certain on that. An African football team was saying, I recognize these chaps from the beach in, wherever it is, Marbella or something like that, saying that they look like beach hawkers. That's not something which he's ever had to contend with in the same way. Trump was unique in terms of his trajectory into national politics in the States, but the kind of character traits that he has of ignorance, racism, massive platform, very rich, incredibly obnoxious, that's not unique to Trump. And that there are many people who could follow that same trajectory. We end up in the same position, debating the limitations of free speech and hoo-ha. And there's no lesson that's been learned in terms of having a consistent approach to, imposing your terms of use and holding people to that standard until it's too late and they've got a hugely powerful position in national politics.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more with all of that. We're going to go through some of Trump's best shit posting now, because whilst he should be condemned to the dustbin of history, there are certain parts of his account which, you do think maybe that should be in a bit of a museum, or at least in a sort of kids' history book to make history more entertaining. We have here, the Coca-Cola company is not happy with me. That's okay. I'll still keep drinking that garbage. That's from 2012. And then later in that year, he says, I've never seen a thin person drinking Diet Coke, which is, again, something. This one, I had to check this one was real, but it is real. If the morons who killed all of those people at Charlie Hebdo would have just waited, the magazine would have folded. No money, no success. Now that's kind of, well, that's sort of like something that even early years Frankie Boyle, he would not have said. Now this is like the person who became president. Like, fucking hell. And this is actually my favorite one, genuinely. At Real Donald Trump. I would like to extend my best wishes to all, even the haters and losers, on this special day, September 11th. No, it is quite funny that someone who tweeted that became president, right?
Like, you can kind of understand that. Do you know what I mean? Like, there's something. I mean, I think that money can have like a corrosive impact on your brain. It can render it sort of smooth and sanded down. It's like something that you'd put on a dirty tile to just like clean it off and render it completely frictionless. And I think that that's the effect that, having oodles of cash has had on Donald Trump's brain. So he kind of says these things and he's like, that's a good thought. I'm going to tweet that thought. It's just, there you go. I think it's a product of immense damage.
Let's go to the best tweet from his presidency. Why would Kim Jong-un insult me by calling me old when I would never call him short and fat? Oh well, I try so hard to be his friend, and maybe someday that will happen.
I hate to say it.
It's a shame that geopolitics won't be carried out like that anymore, right?
I know. I actually thought that was great geopolitics. I hate to say it, but I don't know if this is just like a kind of mirroring or a kind of like, kindred posting spirits kind of thing, or if one changed their posting style to resemble the other. But I kind of think that Aaron's Twitter voice sometimes is a bit Trumpy, not the racism, conspiracy theories, and any of that. I'm talking about that kind of, I don't know, almost like faux naive kind of thing is a bit Aaron.
I mean, it's a decent style of tweeting. It just so happens he's a white supremacist, racist, should be impeached. This is leading to our question from Anne Hayfield with a $5. Will Trump be impeached? So articles for impeachment were officially introduced in the House today. That would make him the first president ever to be impeached. I don't think it's going to happen. The reason I don't is because it would have to pass both the House of Representatives and the Senate. I don't think there are any Republicans in the Senate who going to want to take that risk to actually impeach the guy. There are lots of Republicans now who are sort of creating a little bit of distance between themselves and Trump. Belatedly, obviously, now he's lost. But I think they all know that if they were to really put their neck on the line, then that would damage their chances of surviving any future primary threats. So I think it's going to be much easier for any Republican to just say, look, I don't agree with what he's done, but there's only, it's barely a week now, barely more than a week until he's going to be removed from office anyway. So I can't see impeachment happening. I don't know. Do you differ on that one, Ash? Sorry. I thought it was a Wednesday.
It's like being called by like the ex's name or something. You're like,
you'd put him in my head because we were thinking about his Twitter account.
Oh, you've been with him recently. You're thinking about him when you're with me. Outrageous. No, I don't think that the impeachment's going to go through. I think that while there has been this kind of rhetorical distance and a kind of clawing for respectability amongst some Republicans, it's that radicalized, real nutter butter base that's going to have to, primary them and stuff like that. I just don't think that it's going to happen.
Oh, it would make him the first president to be impeached twice, not the first to be impeached, because I suppose Bill Clinton was impeached. The impeachment was just never completed. I think is the case. The same with Richard Nixon. We're going to go to our final story now. First of all, you know the score. If you are new to this show, please do hit that subscribe button. We go live every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday at 7 p.m. And we want to get up to 200k now. Now we've crossed that 100k threshold. Now, we're all used to Britain's extreme centrists making every one of the world's ills about Jeremy Corbyn. But this weekend, former Labour MP and now crossbench member of the House of Lords, Ian Austin, took the tradition to levels which can only be described as ridiculous. He wrote an article in The Sun, headlined, "Could Congress attack happen in Britain? It could with our lefty mob." Now, in the piece, he asks, what is the difference between Trump using conspiracy theories to claim the election result was stolen and the hard left betrayal myth that claims Corbyn almost won in 2017 but was cheated out of victory by sabotage by moderate MPs and Labour staff? Now, this was, printed in the Sun newspaper. They're not normally people who print high quality journalism. You might not be surprised to see that they printed something again that's not high quality journalism. If you need it spelled out, why the fact that many Jeremy Corbyn supporters, ourselves included, think there was some sabotage within the Labour Party trying to stop him winning the 2017 election, and Donald Trump saying fraud stopped him winning the 2019 election. Two big reasons. One, so there is no evidence whatsoever to support Donald Trump's claim that fraud meant he lost the election. None whatsoever. There's actually quite a lot of hard evidence that people within Labour Party HQ attempted to undermine Labour's electoral chances, or at least were very happy, or were happy too. They were disappointed when Labour did well, and they were very, very willing to act against the wishes of the democratically elected leader. There's hard evidence for that. You can watch our shows on the Labour leaks. More important, though, and this is where I think the comparison is just, so ridiculous that I can't believe someone who was once taken seriously, still is taken seriously by many extreme centrists, could think this was a sensible thing to write, is that Donald Trump's claim about fraud has been used as a justification to try and overthrow the state and to overthrow the results of a democratic election. I haven't spoken to a single Corbynista who said because there were some staffers in the Labour Party HQ who tried to undermine Labour's electoral chances, and because there were some MPs who were constantly attacking Jeremy Corbyn, we need to overthrow the state and annul the 2017 general election results. This comparison does not work. I haven't been saying people should cancel the 2017 general election result and overthrow the state. I just think we probably need a bit more transparency within the Labour Party, a far more reasonable claim. Anyway, some of you might be watching this thinking, why does this all matter? This is just a has-been crank, someone who always attacks Jeremy Corbyn, who this time around is again attacking Jeremy Corbyn. Now, the answer is because this guy was taken very seriously, and not just by, people on the Labour right. It wasn't just by Progress boosting this guy. It was also our national broadcaster. It was also all of our media establishments who, and this is according to a Loughborough study into the media environment in the general election that was shared by Tom Mills, friend of the show, sociologist, which showed that Ian Austin was actually the 11th most prominent politician in the entire mainstream media's coverage of the 2019 general election, the 11th most prominent politician. So this is someone who members of the British public heard from all the time, and it's someone who thinks it's sensible to compare people saying maybe we need a bit more transparency in the organisation of one of Britain's major parties to people who want to violently overthrow the state. To remind you of Ian Austin's role in the 2019 general election campaign, here he is being given a headline slot on Radio 4's Today Show.
The country faces a big choice. There's only two people who can be Prime Minister on December the 13th, Jeremy Corbyn or Boris Johnson. And I think Jeremy Corbyn is completely unfit to lead our country, completely unfit to lead the Labour Party. And after 34 years I joined the Labour Party as a teenager. I worked for the Labour Party. In my 30s, I was a government advisor. In my 40s, I was an MP and a minister. So it's really come to something when I tell decent, traditional, patriotic Labour voters that they should be voting for Boris Johnson at this election. I can't believe it's come to this, but that's where we are.
It's really come to something when me, someone who passionately hates Jeremy Corbyn and the left wing of the Labour Party so much that I can't see the difference between them and far-right people with Holocaust slogans on their jumpers breaking in to the Capitol building because they've bought into some lie that the election was stolen because of bits inside machines in Georgia. You know, you hate Jeremy Corbyn so much you think he's like Trump, yet the BBC took you seriously when you said, oh, it's a really difficult decision for me to make. It's so difficult for me to tell people to vote for someone other than Jeremy Corbyn because I'm so committed to the Labour Party. He's a fraud. He's clearly a fraud. And I would hope that there are some people, you know, within the higher echelons of the BBC who are questioning, why did we give this guy such high prominence during this general election when clearly he's not really motivated by some desire to get a healthy, good government for patriotic Britons, bit of an odd phrase in itself. He's not someone who it wasn't a difficult decision for him to tell people not to vote for Jeremy Corbyn. He passionately hates him so irrationally, so in such a deranged manner that he'd make this comparison. Now they should hang their heads in shame. Ash, you know these media insiders better than I do. Will there be anyone in the top echelons of the BBC who are questioning how much prominence they gave this guy?
No. just a really straightforward answer. No. And that's because I don't think you can ever overestimate the degree to which both the venality and idiocy permeates the kind of heart of our broadcasting establishment. People like easy stories, you know, consumable storylines, and Ian Austen was a packaged storyline, which is, you know, Labour man through and through, and was forced to make the hardest decision of his life to take down his most loathed political opponent. But it's a compelling storyline. And so people were willing to just absolutely eat that up. And there is very little reflection in these kind of broadcasting circles about whether or not something that they'd done before was the right thing to do. Right. I've never really seen a reckoning that wasn't forced by, you know, either, you know, the Leveson inquiry or, you know, a complaint being upheld by a press or broadcast regulator. So that kind of reflexiveness that you're talking about just doesn't exist within our media establishment. It really doesn't. And I think that you've also got the fact that there is an alignment of interests to make sure that the left goes down with Jeremy Corbyn, right? That, you know, he's the Titanic and we're all, you know, the passengers who are in third class, you know, sinking below the line of the iceberg. And it's an interest which is shared by multiple actors. One is that you've got, you know, those kind of agrocentrists who were more threatened in lots of ways by an emergent and renewed left than they were by a nationalist and increasingly authoritarian right. Because if you're an agrocentrist and you are used to your spot in the media or your job in the Labour Party, a new leadership of the Labour Party, new set of blood in the Labour Party is much more of a direct threat to your job than another 5 years of Tory government, right? So you've got one set of interests there. You've got an ideological interest, which is shared between, you know, the kind of agro centre, not the entirety of the centre. There's some very, very, you know, kind of, you know, genial centrists out there, but the agro centre and, you know, the populist right, which is redraw the boundary of reasonable opinion so that it excludes the left. The centrists want to do that because it means that they're as far as you can go, and the right want to do that because it's part of an ever-moving, great moving right show, in the words of Stuart Hall. And Ian Austen is still someone who can play a compelling role in that. He can be the patriotic, decent Labour man who is speaking to a dedicated Labour audience of Sun readers, and can kind of continue this bit of political theatre, which, until there is a significant challenge mounted to it in the establishment media by a dissenting voice, an alternative voice, that other story is never going to be told. And I think that because of this kind of, you know, attempt to realign reasonable opinion so it's to the left's detriment, you're not going to necessarily see that being staged, right? You're not going to see Ian Austen placed in a circumstance where he is going to be challenged in such a robust way. I think that was more likely in 2019. You know, you'd get some poor fucker from Momentum or something being hauled up so they can have strips of, just strips torn off of them. But I don't think that that's going to happen now. But you will see that story repeated and repeated. It's not exactly, I'm not saying anything which is particularly optimistic, I guess. And I suppose the only thing to be hopeful about is that you have this huge generational chasm in terms of voting behavior and also media consumption. You have an aging broadcast audience, you have an aging print media audience. So where Ian Austin is making his pitch is not where, 2024, 2029, those sets of voters, increasingly young voters, are going to be. And I think that you are going to see a, long-term, kind of counterweight emerge of young voters who really don't see their material interests and social values being reflected back to them in the establishment media. And that will take a kind of political form as well as just changed viewing and reading habits. But I don't think you're going to see Ian Austin singing a different tune now. Not when it's had him, rewarded quite so well. I don't think that he'd have gotten a seat in the House of Lords were it not for his service to the Conservative Party. There you have it.
It was quite explicit, wasn't it? Really, saying you've attacked the Labour Party and told people to vote for Boris Johnson. Therefore, Boris Johnson gives you a peerage. You get to sit in the House of Lords for life on a cushy daily rate with a political voice forever.
If slagging you off got me £300 a day, I'm sorry, mate.
I wouldn't blame you. I wouldn't blame you.
I don't like you that much. I like you a lot.
I'd insult myself from an alt account for £300 a day. We should wrap up there. Obviously, you might have been watching that segment thinking, oh my God, our disgraceful media who was so willing to give these cranks like Ian Austin airtime, if only to serve their agenda of attacking the possibility of a socialist prime minister. You might think, oh, that's all very depressing. It's quite depressing. I have to agree with you there. But there is an alternative. If we keep building left-wing media, we can not only put pressure on the BBC to be more fair in terms of how they report stuff, but ultimately, replace some of these organisations. We know how effective things like the Daily Telegraph are at dragging the BBC to the right. We know that Andrew Neil at the moment is starting GB News precisely to try and drag the BBC to the right. So it is more important now than ever that we build left-wing alternatives that can put forward, I'm not even going to say a more progressive perspective, but a more reasonable perspective on what's going on in this country right now. Because, I mean, from that example there you've seen of Ian Austin, it's not always going to happen from the BBC, unfortunately. They do some good things, they do some bad things, but they're getting dragged in the wrong direction. Let's go to a couple more comments before we end the show. Cassia George Lewandowski. It's my mum Chris's birthday today. Could we get a shout out? Long-time watchers. Thanks for everything you do. Huge respect and solidarity to everyone at Novara Media. Thank you so much, and happy birthday to Chris. I hope you have a great day. Unfortunately in lockdown, but that's what we all have to deal with these days, isn't it? Ash, it has been a pleasure speaking to you on this Monday evening.
Best part of my week.
Yeah, just keep getting those coffees. Don't feel guilty. I don't know. Well, it's contentious.
I think you know what. I mean, for as long as it's legal, I'm gonna keep going to the cafe down the road.
Yeah, you're following the rules. That's all we can ask of people.
Still, so
you what? Sorry,
I've still got antibodies in it. So
that is true. You
corona in November.
Yeah, like a superhero.
Yeah,
okay, let's end this. Sorry, I don't know if I cut you out there very briefly, but we are going to end there. Thank you so much for watching. We'll be back on Wednesday at 7 p.m. Ash has got an interview out tomorrow at 7 p.m. Make sure you tune into that with Davina De Campo from the first series of UK Drag Race. The second series starts I think this week, or maybe it started on the weekend. I'm very excited about both of those things. For now, you've been watching Tysky Sour on Novara Media. Good night.